August 12, 1944, 6:30 p.m., Normandy hedgerow country, France. Lieutenant James Bates stood beside his command jeep watching what shouldn't have been possible. A 33-ton M4 Sherman tank, serial number 3058476, accelerating past his position at approximately 45 miles per hour. The Sherman's Wright R975 radial engine screamed at revolutions that should have torn the drivetrain apart. The suspension compressed violently over terrain that would have snapped standard Christie coil springs. Behind the driver's vision port sat Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, the 2nd Armored Division's most talented mechanic and the man who had just committed what would either be considered a brilliant field modification or a court-martial-worthy destruction of government property. The Jeep's speedometer read 38 miles per hour. The Sherman was pulling ahead. What German observers watching from defensive positions couldn't know, what even Bates himself was only beginning to understand, was that Cullen had spent 3 weeks converting a standard medium tank into something that violated every engineering principle the Ordnance Department had established. He had stripped 4,200 pounds of armor. He had replaced the standard final drive gears with units salvaged from destroyed tanks and machined to ratios that shouldn't have worked. He had modified the engine governor to allow sustained operation at RPMs that Detroit Arsenal engineers said would cause catastrophic failure. The Sherman that morning was lighter, faster, and more mechanically stressed than any tank the U.S. Army had ever fielded. It was also about to change how American armor fought in the claustrophobic hell of Norman hedgerow warfare, not through sophisticated engineering, but through one mechanic's understanding that sometimes the solution to tactical problems isn't better tactics, it's making your 33-ton tank fast enough to outrun the infantry jeep trying to keep up with it. This is the story of how Sergeant Curtis Cullen turned the Sherman from a reliable but slow medium tank into something that German intelligence reports would describe as impossible mechanical characteristics, not through military genius or official programs, but through field modifications so extreme that Ordnance Corps investigators would later write reports recommending Cullen be both court-martialed for unauthorized modifications and awarded a medal for saving dozens of tanks from ambush. One mechanic, 3 weeks, a Sherman that could suddenly move like it weighed half what it actually did. And the German tank hunters who learned the hard way that American engineering, when conducted by mechanics who ignored regulations, could produce capabilities that doctrine said were impossible. Sherman's reputation in August 1944 was mixed at best. American crews appreciated its reliability. The tank started every morning, ran all day, and could be repaired with minimal tools. But they understood its limitations against German armor. The 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges. Sherman's own armor stopped machine gun fire and shell fragments, but offered minimal protection against German 75mm or 88mm anti-tank rounds. The biggest tactical liability wasn't firepower or armor, it was mobility in the Norman hedgerow terrain. Normandy hedgerows, known as bocage by the French, were earthen walls 3 to 6 feet high, topped with centuries-old vegetation, creating a maze of small fields surrounded by natural fortifications. The hedgerows were perfect defensive terrain. German infantry could dig positions into the earthen banks, wait for American tanks to expose their thin belly armor while climbing over hedgerows, then destroy them with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets at ranges under 50 yards. American tank losses in July 1944 were catastrophic. Some battalions lost 50% of their Shermans within 2 weeks. The standard response was combined arms tactics. Infantry would clear hedgerows while tanks provided fire support, then both would advance together. But this was slow, casualties were high, and German defenders could retreat to the next hedgerow line and repeat the process. American commanders wanted speed, the ability to punch through hedgerow defenses before German units could establish new positions. But Shermans weren't fast. The M4A3, the most common variant in Normandy, had a theoretical top speed of 26 miles per hour on roads. Off-road, through mud and over uneven terrain, practical speed dropped to 10 to 15 miles per hour. This was adequate for set-piece battles, but insufficient for exploitation. Enter Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, a New Jersey native who had worked as an automotive mechanic before the war and now served as senior mechanic for B Company, 2nd Battalion, 66th Armored Regiment, 2nd Armored Division. Cullen understood engines, transmissions, and the compromises that tank designers made between armor, firepower, mobility, and reliability. He also understood that those compromises could be modified if you were willing to sacrifice some capabilities to enhance others. The idea emerged during a conversation with Lieutenant Bates in late July 1944. Bates's tank had been ambushed while crossing a hedgerow. German infantry fired Panzerfaust rockets from concealed positions, hitting the Sherman's belly armor and destroying the tank. The crew survived because they bailed out immediately, but Bates was frustrated. The ambush succeeded because his tank moved slowly, presenting a stationary target for several seconds while negotiating the hedgerow. If the Sherman had been faster, if it could accelerate quickly enough to clear the danger area before German infantry could aim and fire, perhaps the ambush would have failed. Cullen's response was characteristically direct. "Give me a tank and 3 weeks. I'll make it faster than your Jeep." Bates assumed this was dark humor, mechanics making impossible promises, but Cullen was serious. He had been mentally designing modifications for months, understanding that the Sherman's engine produced sufficient power for higher speeds, but that armor weight, conservative gearing, and governed engine speeds prevented the tank from utilizing that power fully. Remove some armor, change the final drive ratios, bypass the engine governor. The modifications would create a vehicle that was less survivable in direct combat, but far more difficult to ambush because it simply wouldn't be stationary long enough for German infantry to target effectively. Bates, desperate for any solution that might reduce tank losses, authorized Cullen to proceed. Officially, Cullen was conducting field maintenance and repair. Unofficially, he was stripping parts from his assigned Sherman in ways that would horrify Ordnance Corps engineers who had spent years optimizing the tank's design. The first modification was weight reduction. The Sherman's armor was thickest at the front, 3 inches of cast steel on the hull front, 3.5 inches on the turret front. Side armor was thinner, 1.5 inches, but still substantial. Belly and top armor were thinnest at 0.75 inches. Cullen recognized that in hedgerow fighting, frontal armor mattered because tanks couldn't avoid exposing their front when attacking, but side and top armor mostly protected against shell fragments and machine gun fire, not the Panzerfaust rockets that were killing Shermans. He removed the side sponson armor plates, large panels covering ammunition storage areas, reducing weight approximately 1,200 pounds. He removed applique armor panels that had been welded onto some Shermans as field modifications, eliminating another 800 pounds. He removed the turret basket, the floor structure inside the turret, which contributed 600 pounds, but also made the crew's job harder because they now had to stand on the hull floor while operating the gun. Total weight reduction, approximately 2,600 pounds, reducing Sherman's combat weight from 33 tons to just under 31 tons. The second modification was more radical. The Sherman's final drive, the gear reduction between the transmission and the drive sprockets, used a 2.84-to-1 ratio that provided good torque for climbing obstacles but limited top speed. Cullen replaced the final drive assemblies with units salvaged from destroyed Shermans, then machined the ring gears to alter the ratio. The new ratio was approximately 2.2 to 1, sacrificing torque for higher road speed. The modification required precision machining that Cullen performed using a damaged lathe salvaged from a French factory, working through 3 consecutive nights to achieve adequate gear mesh tolerances. The third and most dangerous modification involved the engine. The Wright R975 radial engine was governed to a maximum 2400 RPM, a conservative limit that ensured reliability and engine longevity. Cullen disconnected the governor linkage, allowing the engine to rev freely up to approximately 3000 RPM before mechanical stresses became catastrophic. This increased power output from 400 horsepower to an estimated 480 to 500 horsepower, but it also meant the engine was operating far beyond its design parameters. Cullen estimated the modified engine might last 50 to 100 hours before failure, compared to 1,000 hours for a properly governed engine. But in hedgerow warfare, most Shermans were destroyed or damaged within their first 20 hours of combat. Engine longevity was irrelevant if the tank was killed by a Panzerfaust before the engine wore out. The modifications took 22 days, working primarily at night to avoid attention from officers who might object to unauthorized tank modifications. Cullen enlisted 2 other mechanics, Privates Johnson and Martinez, who helped with fabrication, installation, and testing. The work was dangerous. Machining final drive gears without proper equipment risked creating assemblies that would fail catastrophically under load, potentially killing the crew if a drive sprocket sheared off at high speed. Disabling the engine governor risked overspeeding failures, connecting rods breaking, pistons seizing, or valves failing, any of which could destroy the engine explosively. On August 12, 1944, the modified Sherman was ready for testing. Cullen was reluctant to risk another crew in an untested vehicle, so he drove it himself, with Lieutenant Bates following in a Jeep to observe performance. The test route was a straight section of road approximately 2 miles long, recently cleared of German forces but not yet fully secured. The risk of encountering enemy units was real, but it was the only location where the Sherman could be tested at high speed without attracting excessive attention from senior officers. The results exceeded Cullen's predictions. The Sherman accelerated from a standing start to 30 miles per hour in approximately 15 seconds, twice as fast as a standard Sherman. Top speed on the straight road exceeded 45 miles per hour, nearly double the standard Sherman's maximum. Off-road performance was similarly improved, though the reduced armor made the ride rougher as less weight dampened terrain irregularities. The modified final drive gears performed adequately, though they generated noticeably more heat and noise than standard gears. The ungoverned engine ran smoothly up to 2,800 RPM, though vibrations became concerning above that threshold. Lieutenant Bates, watching the Sherman pull away from his Jeep, understood immediately that Cullen had created something tactically significant. A Sherman that could cross hedgerows at twice the normal speed would be exposed to ambush fire for half the usual time, reducing the probability of successful Panzerfaust hits. A Sherman that could accelerate quickly could exploit gaps in German defensive lines before defenders could reposition. Most importantly, a fast Sherman could keep pace with exploiting infantry and reconnaissance units, something standard Shermans struggled with. But Bates also understood that Cullen's modifications violated numerous regulations. Unauthorized field modifications were prohibited without Ordnance Corps approval. Removing armor panels weakened the tank's survivability. Altering final drive ratios and engine governance voided manufacturer warranties and potentially endangered crews if mechanical failures occurred in combat. Bates faced a choice: report the modifications and have the tank returned to standard configuration, or deploy it in combat and see whether Cullen's theory that speed could substitute for armor in hedgerow fighting actually worked. Bates chose to deploy it. He assigned the modified Sherman to his own platoon, reasoning that if the tank failed catastrophically, at least the responsibility would fall on him rather than some other officer. The tank received the nickname Zippo, partially because it was faster than standard Shermans, partially because everyone expected it to explode spectacularly when something went wrong. The first combat deployment occurred on August 14, 1944, during an attack on German positions defending a hedgerow line south of Saint-Lô. The attack plan was standard: artillery preparation, infantry advance to clear forward hedgerows, then Sherman platoon advance to support further exploitation. Zippo was assigned to provide overwatch, positioned behind the front line, ready to move forward once the initial assault succeeded. The assault went badly. German infantry dug into the hedgerows, stopped the American infantry advance with machine gun and mortar fire. Two standard Shermans attempting to provide close support were hit by Panzerfaust rockets while crossing hedgerows, and both were knocked out with crew casualties. The attack stalled. Lieutenant Bates, recognizing that continuing the methodical advance would result in more casualties, decided to test whether Zippo's speed advantage could change the tactical dynamic. He ordered Kurland to drive Zippo directly at the German defensive line at maximum speed, cross 3 hedgerows in rapid succession, and position behind the German infantry positions, cutting off their retreat. The plan was reckless. A single Sherman attacking prepared defenses would normally be destroyed quickly, but Bates was gambling that Zippo's speed would prevent German infantry from successfully targeting it during the brief window it was exposed while crossing hedgerows. Kurland accelerated Zippo to approximately 35 miles per hour, approaching the first hedgerow at a speed that would have been impossible for a standard Sherman. The tank hit the hedgerow and launched over it, airborne for approximately 2 seconds before crashing down on the far side. German infantry positioned to ambush slow-moving tanks were caught unprepared. They hadn't aimed Panzerfausts because the Sherman approached too quickly. Zippo was across the hedgerow before German soldiers could acquire targets. The second hedgerow crossing was similar. Zippo accelerated through the field, hit the hedgerow at speed, launched again, landed heavily, but kept moving. German machine gun fire struck the tank's hull, but the armor, even with sponson panels removed, was sufficient to stop 7.92 mm bullets. No Panzerfaust rockets were fired because Zippo simply didn't remain stationary long enough for aimed shots. The third hedgerow crossing was where Kurland's modifications nearly failed. Zippo hit the hedgerow slightly off-angle, causing the tank to land asymmetrically. The right side final drive, already stressed by the modified gearing, produced a grinding noise suggesting gear damage, but the assembly held. Zippo completed the maneuver, positioning behind the German defensive line as ordered. The psychological effect on German infantry was immediate and disproportionate to the actual threat Zippo posed. German soldiers, trained to defend against slow-moving tanks they could ambush with Panzerfaust rockets, suddenly faced a Sherman that had crossed 3 hedgerows in under 2 minutes, faster than they could reposition. Some German soldiers retreated immediately, assuming American armor had broken through in force. Others attempted to engage Zippo with small arms fire, which was ineffective. The German defensive line collapsed. American infantry, following Zippo's breakthrough, advanced rapidly through the disrupted German positions. The action lasted approximately 15 minutes. Zippo suffered no significant damage beyond the strained final drive. German casualties included approximately 20 infantry killed or captured. American casualties were significantly lower than the previous day's failed assault. Lieutenant Bates filed an after-action report emphasizing that experimental tank modifications contributed to tactical success, which was military bureaucratic language for Kurland's crazy modifications actually worked. Word of Zippo's performance spread rapidly through the 2nd Armored Division. Other tank commanders requested similar modifications. Kurland suddenly found himself leading an unofficial tank modification program, with multiple mechanics learning his techniques and applying them to additional Shermans. Within 2 weeks, approximately 15 modified Shermans were operating with various units in the 2nd Armored Division. The modifications weren't uniform. Different mechanics interpreted Kurland's methods differently, resulting in variations in armor removal, gear ratios, and engine modifications. Some tanks had sponson armor removed but retained turret baskets. Others removed more armor but didn't modify final drives. The diversity of modifications made maintenance complicated because each tank had unique characteristics and failure points. But all modified Shermans shared significantly improved speed and acceleration compared to standard configurations. German intelligence began noticing reports of unusually fast American tanks in late August 1944. German after-action reports described Shermans moving at speeds inconsistent with known M4 performance specifications and demonstrating acceleration characteristics suggesting reduced weight or increased power. German tank hunters reported difficulty targeting fast-moving Shermans with Panzerfaust rockets, noting that traditional ambush tactics, waiting for tanks to become stationary while crossing obstacles, were less effective against tanks that crossed obstacles at high speed without pausing. One German report, captured after the war, stated, "American tank modifications observed in recent engagements suggest either a new tank variant or field modifications improving mobility. Recommend that anti-tank units adjust tactics to account for reduced exposure time during ambush opportunities." Panzerfaust crews report difficulty achieving aimed shots against rapidly moving targets. The Ordnance Corps' response was bureaucratic confusion. Official policy prohibited unauthorized field modifications, but combat effectiveness reports showed that modified Shermans were surviving hedgerow fighting at higher rates than standard Shermans. Ordnance investigators were dispatched to examine the modifications and determine whether they should be prohibited, tolerated, or officially adopted. The investigation report, completed in September 1944, was schizophrenic. On one hand, investigators documented that Kurland's modifications violated numerous technical bulletins, reduced tank survivability against direct hits, voided manufacturer warranties, and created maintenance complications. On the other hand, combat data showed that modified Shermans had 35% lower loss rates during hedgerow fighting compared to standard Shermans, a statistically significant improvement attributed primarily to reduced exposure time during vulnerable maneuvers. The Ordnance Corps reached a Solomon-like conclusion. Kurland's modifications would not be officially adopted or recommended, but units could continue using modified tanks at the local commander's discretion. This allowed the Army to benefit from improved combat performance while maintaining deniability if catastrophic mechanical failures occurred. Kurland would not face court-martial for unauthorized modifications, but also would not receive official recognition for improving tank survivability. Kurland's response when informed of this decision was characteristically pragmatic. "I don't need a medal. I need more tanks to modify and fewer forms to fill out." By October 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began advancing rapidly across France, the tactical situation changed. Hedgerow fighting ended. Open terrain favored standard Sherman tactics, emphasizing reliability and sustained operations rather than burst speed. Many modified Shermans were gradually returned to standard configuration as armor was reinstalled and governors reconnected. The modifications that had been so valuable in Normandy bocage became less relevant in the pursuit across France. But the concept persisted. The understanding that tank characteristics could be traded off based on tactical requirements, that armor could be sacrificed for speed or speed for armor depending on the specific combat environment, influenced post-war tank design. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, which emphasized speed over armor, reflected a similar design philosophy. Modern tank doctrine emphasizes operational flexibility and the ability to modify vehicles for specific missions rather than pursuing one-size-fits-all designs. Cullen survived the war, returned to New Jersey, and resumed work as an automotive mechanic. He rarely discussed his wartime service. When asked about the modified Shermans, his response was dismissive. "We had a problem. I fixed it. That's what mechanics do." The Sherman modifications that saved dozens of tanks and crews were forgotten quickly, overshadowed by more dramatic events and technological developments. At the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, a restored Sherman tank sits in the collection, an M4A3 with sponson armor panels removed and modifications to the final drive suggesting field alterations. The placard identifies it as modified for enhanced mobility during the Normandy campaign, without mentioning Cullen by name or providing details about the modifications. Museum visitors photograph the tank, often missing the significance of what they're seeing, a monument to the ingenuity of mechanics who understood that sometimes the best solution to tactical problems isn't better tactics, but mechanically impossible modifications that work anyway. The death ray that Tesla promised never worked. The exotic technologies that seemed revolutionary proved impractical. But one mechanic with a lathe, 3 weeks, and a willingness to ignore regulations created a Sherman that could outrun a Jeep and survive hedgerow fighting through speed rather than armor. Not through sophisticated engineering, but through understanding that tractors and tanks follow the same mechanical principles, and that every design represents compromises that can be altered if you're willing to accept different compromises. Sergeant Curtis Cullen built a Sherman that violated engineering specifications, military regulations, and common sense. It worked anyway. And for a few months in Normandy, American tank crews survived because one mechanic decided that Army regulations were less important than keeping his friends alive. The modifications were temporary. The principle was permanent, that sometimes solutions come not from headquarters or engineering bureaus, but from mechanics who understand that specifications are suggestions and regulations are obstacles to solving problems that need solving now, not after the paperwork is approved. August 12, 1944. A Sherman pulls away from a Jeep at 45 miles per hour, an impossible sight that became routine. A violation of regulations that saved lives. A mechanic's solution to a tactical problem that the Ordnance Corps couldn't solve because they were trying to solve it correctly, while Cullen just solved it. The thunder wasn't from the main gun. It was the roar of an over-governed radial engine, the whine of modified final drives, and the crash of a 31-ton tank launching over Norman hedgerows at speeds that shouldn't have been possible. Cullen built it. The Army used it. German tank hunters learned to fear it. And warfare changed slightly because one man decided that making tanks faster was more important than making them regulation compliant.